June 28, 1944. Near Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. The rain had turned the hedgerows into walls of mud and smoke. American Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Haynes leaned out of the hatch of his M4A3 Sherman, squinting through the drizzle that clung to his goggles. The smell of diesel, wet earth, and cordite hung thick in the morning air. "Panther up ahead, 300 yards, shouted Corporal Lewis, the gunner, his voice muffled by the headset's static. Through the commander's periscope, Haynes could see it, a German Panther OSF. Its long 75mm gun barrel cutting across the narrow French lane. The beast loomed behind a hedgerow, its dark armor slick with rain, camouflaged with fresh leaves. It looked indestructible. The Sherman rolled forward cautiously. Its engine, a throaty Ford GAA, hummed with nervous energy. Haynes knew the odds. A Panther's frontal armor could shrug off almost anything the Sherman threw at it. One shot from that high-velocity gun, and the Sherman would be a fireball. But they had numbers, and speed. Lewis, fire smoke. Jenkins, flank left. Haynes barked. A white cloud burst between the two tanks. The crew lurched as the Sherman pushed through the mud, swinging around a farmstead to the Panther's exposed side. Inside, it was chaos, shells clattering in the loader's arms, the hull shaking with every rut and impact. He loaded. Ready. Target that road, fire. The Sherman's 75mm cannon roared. The shot struck the Panther's side plate. A flash, then a plume of black smoke erupted from its engine compartment. The German tank shuddered to a stop, its thick armor now useless as flames licked from the vents. For a brief moment, the American stared, breathing hard, watching the superior machine burn. "That thing looked invincible," Jenkins muttered. "Guess not." But as the fire crackled, Haynes couldn't shake a thought. The Panther's design, sleek, sloped, powerful, seemed a world apart from their own clunky Ronson tank, nicknamed after a lighter for how easily it ignited. Yet here they stood, alive in their so-called trap, while the Germans inside their masterpiece were gone. Later that afternoon, as engineers and recovery teams arrived, they inspected the wreck. One sergeant, part of the Ordnance Corps, ran his hands over the Panther's armor, shaking his head. "Beautiful design," he said. "Terrible for the field. You wouldn't believe the trouble these things give the Krauts." Haynes raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? Looked like it gave us plenty." "Not the way you think," the sergeant replied. "These things overheat, seize up, burn their clutches. They're more garage queens than war machines." The revelation spread through the company like wildfire. A captured Panther meant curiosity, and experimentation. Over the next few days, U.S. mechanics and tankers began testing one they'd managed to recover intact. It sat hulking in a hedgerow clearing, its black cross faintly visible under grime and ash. When Haynes climbed inside for the first time, he was struck by the cramped, almost claustrophobic feel. The controls were stiff, the gears groaned, and the vision slits offered barely any visibility. "How do they even drive this thing?" he muttered, twisting the starter crank. The engine coughed, rattled, then belched a puff of black smoke before dying. Mechanic Sergeant Miller, covered in grease, laughed. "Welcome to German engineering. Looks good in a parade. Not so much when you're knee-deep in Normandy mud." Over the next hours, the Americans struggled to coax life out of the Panther. Its Maybach engine overheated within minutes. The transmission clanked like a bag of bolts. Each fix revealed another weakness, overcomplicated systems that demanded constant care. Meanwhile, parked beside it, a row of Shermans idled smoothly, their crews eating rations, refueling, checking treads. They weren't perfect, but they worked. By evening, as twilight fell across the field, Haynes stood between the two tanks, one a mechanical marvel turned liability, the other a mass-produced survivor. The contrast was unmistakable. War didn't reward perfection. It rewarded endurance. The Panther might win on paper, but on the battlefield, it was the Sherman that kept moving forward. July 2, 1944. Allied Ordnance Testing Ground, near Isigny-sur-Mer, Normandy. The morning fog clung low over the field, blurring the outlines of tanks scattered across the grass like steel beasts sleeping after battle. Engineers and mechanics in grease-stained uniforms huddled around a captured Panther OSF. Its turret marked with fresh white stars to prevent friendly fire. Staff Sergeant Bobby Haynes watched from a few paces away, helmet under his arm, coffee steaming in his hand. Across the field, a Sherman sat idling, its engine humming smoothly, a sound so familiar it was almost comforting. "Let's see what this cat can do," said Captain Daniel Price, the testing officer, flipping open his clipboard. His tone was cautious but curious, like a man about to meet a legend face to face. The German engine coughed, sputtered, and finally came alive in a throaty roar. A plume of black smoke rose from the rear deck. The Maybach V-12 sounded powerful, but uneven, the kind of power that strained instead of flowed. "Throttle it!" Price shouted. The Panther jerked forward, gears grinding in protest. Mud splattered from its wide tracks as it lumbered across the field. The driver fought the controls, his arms locked in a tense struggle against the heavy steering levers. Haynes could hear him swearing through the open hatch. "Feels like driving a damn tractor with no power steering," the driver yelled. Price scribbled notes, expression tightening. "Turning radius, sluggish. Gear response, delayed." The Panther rolled to a halt beside a Sherman for comparison. Even standing still, the difference between them was striking. The Panther looked like a hunter, sloped armor, predatory stance, that long, elegant 75mm KWK-42 gun. The Sherman, by contrast, looked boxy, almost plain. But when the crews swapped positions, the truth became clear. Inside the Panther, it was hell. "Visibility near zero," Haynes muttered, pressing his face to the narrow periscopes. "Feels like you're looking through a letterbox." The loader's station was even worse, cramped, dark, and cluttered with ammunition racks. Sweat dripped from their necks in the heat trapped inside. Meanwhile, across the field, Sherman crews had already swapped engines, refueled, and were preparing to run another test drive. The Americans could strip and rebuild a Sherman in half a day, every part interchangeable, every system simple enough to understand in the field. "Captain," Miller called out from under the Panther's chassis, "take a look at this. Final drive housings leaking again. This thing's a maintenance nightmare." Price crouched, frowning. "That's the third mechanical fault in less than an hour." Miller wiped his hands on a rag. "You couldn't keep one of these running in a real fight, not for long. Too complicated. Too fragile." By noon, the Panther's engine gave up again, hissing steam as coolant spilled across the mud. The crew climbed out, coughing, faces slick with sweat and frustration. "Beautiful monster," Haynes said, watching the smoke curl into the gray sky. "But it kills its own men before we even shoot at it." Price nodded. "The Germans built for power, not practicality. It's a tank designed for engineers, not soldiers." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, the Sherman crews gathered near a fire, swapping stories. The day's lesson was clear: the Panther was a technical marvel but a battlefield burden. "Give me the Sherman any day," Lewis said, poking at the fire with a stick. "She might light up like a candle sometimes, but she'll run. And when she runs, she wins." Haynes looked toward the silhouette of their tank parked nearby, mud-caked and dented but alive. He realized the secret to their survival wasn't in the armor or the gun. It was in the heartbeat, the relentless, mechanical rhythm of something built not to impress, but to endure. War wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. And in that, the Sherman was king. July 8, 1944. south of Saint-Lô, Normandy. The hedgerow country was a nightmare, narrow lanes boxed in by earthen walls, every bend a potential ambush. The 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, advanced cautiously through the green maze, Shermans grinding through mud and undergrowth. Inside Haynes' Sherman, the air was thick with the stench of oil and sweat. The radio crackled. All units, Panther sighted, grid 43B, near the crossroads at La Chapelle. Haynes' stomach tightened. The Germans were desperate now, fighting with what armor they had left, often just a few tanks, expertly concealed. A single Panther could halt an entire column if it struck first. Lewis, load AP. Jenkins, keep your eyes on that tree lean, Haynes ordered. They moved forward slowly, the engine growling under strain. The rhythmic clank-clank of treads filled the cramped space. Every man inside knew the odds, the Panther could destroy them before they even saw it. Suddenly, a flash. A shell screamed across the hedgerow and slammed into the lead Sherman, an eruption of flame and smoke. The radio filled with static and screaming. Panther, 11 o'clock. Lewis yelled. Reverse. Reverse. The Sherman lurched backward as another German round whistled overhead. Dirt showered down through the open hatch. Smoke out. Jenkins fired a white phosphorus shell, creating a thick screen between them and the tree-lean. Haynes took a breath. All right, boys, time to dance. He swung the Sherman down a side lane, using the smoke as cover. They circled wide, crashing through a farm fence and into a field of wheat. The tank's suspension jolted violently as they cut across uneven ground, but the engine held. Panthers blind to our flank, Lewis muttered, scanning through the gun sight. Range, 200 yards. Fire. The 75mm cannon thundered. The round struck the Panther's side armor with a metallic crack, sparks flying. The German turret jerked, then froze. Hit. Again. The second shot punched through the rear armor. Black smoke belched out. A moment later, the German crew bailed out, 2 men stumbling from the hatch, clothes aflame. Silence. Only the ticking of the Sherman's engine filled the aftermath. Haynes exhaled, hand trembling slightly. She may be a death trap, he muttered, but she's our death trap. Later that evening, the crews regrouped in a bombed-out French barn. A captured Panther sat nearby, riddled with holes, one tread broken. Mechanics examined it under lantern light, murmuring in disbelief. Look at that armor, one said. You'd think it could take anything. Not from the side, Miller replied, wiping his hands. That's the thing, all that front armor, but useless if you move fast and think smarter. Haynes crouched near the destroyed Panther. Inside, he saw the driver's compartment twisted from the blast, the smell of burned oil heavy in the air. He thought about the German crew, professionals, well-trained, but trapped by their own machine. Back at his Sherman, he ran a hand along the rough steel hull. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't advanced. But it forgave mistakes. It ran when battered. It fought when outnumbered. And most importantly, it brought its men home. As night fell, the sound of tank engines rumbled in the distance, a reminder that the war wasn't done. But the lesson of that day would stick with every tanker who survived Normandy. The Germans built tanks to win battles. The Americans built tanks to win wars. July 12, 1944. U.S. Ordnance Depot, Corentin, Normandy. The captured Panther sat on a concrete pad, its hatches open, its innards laid bare like the corpse of a dissected giant. Engineers in khaki shirts and oily gloves crawled across it, measuring, noting, muttering. Each clang of a wrench echoed through the depot like a surgeon's heartbeat. Captain Daniel Price stood beside Haynes, flipping through a maintenance log. In theory, he said, the Panther should have been unstoppable. 80mm sloped armor, 75mm high-velocity gun, 700 horsepower Maybach engine. It's a masterpiece, on paper. He pointed toward a team struggling to remove a transmission panel. But this is what kills it. The gearbox was massive, thick, complicated, and nearly impossible to remove without disassembling half the front hull. The men strained, cursed, and finally stepped back, defeated. "Can't be done without a crane," one mechanic said. "You break this thing in the field, you're not fixing it. You're abandoning it." Haynes crossed his arms. "So they've got the best armor and the best gun, but can't keep it running?" "Exactly," Price said. "The Germans built tanks like race cars, tuned to perfection, but they fall apart when pushed too hard. We build tractors, ugly, slow, but they don't stop working." Nearby, a chalkboard listed the Panther's recorded issues. Transmission failure after 150 kilometers. Fuel pump overheating. Track shedding in soft terrain. Limited field visibility. A German prisoner, a young mechanic captured days before, stood silently nearby, guarded by MPs. His name tag read Keller. Price motioned him forward. "Tell him we want to know," Price said to the interpreter, "how often they could keep one of these in service." Keller spoke quietly, his voice tired. "In my unit, maybe 1 in 3 ran each week. The others waited for parts. Always parts." Haynes frowned. 1 in 3? That's not an army, that's a museum. Keller nodded. "Our Panthers, too heavy, too hot. Engines burn. Oil leaks. But when one fights, it kills everything." That last sentence hung in the air, quiet truth from a defeated soldier. Haynes stared at the engine bay, the labyrinth of pipes and bolts. "No wonder they lose ground. You can't win with ghosts of tanks." Price closed his logbook. "That's why our boys call it the Panther's curse. It wins the duel, but loses the war." That afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Haynes' unit rolled out again. The Shermans lined up, engines idling like a chorus of steady drums. Across the depot, the Panther remained silent, lifeless, too complex for its own good. A sergeant from maintenance approached Haynes with a grin. "Funny thing, Sarge. The Panther's gun sight? Couldn't see worth a damn when it fogged. Ours? Simple, wipe it off, keep going." Haynes chuckled. "Guess simplicity saves lives." When they hit the road again, the Sherman's engine sang its familiar tune, rough, but dependable. They passed wrecked Panthers on the roadside, some burned out, others abandoned intact, their engines seized. The sight became routine, another testament to a flawed masterpiece. At one point, Jenkins joked over the intercom, "If I ever see another Panther, I'm not scared, I'm thinking maybe it's out of gas." The crew laughed, but the truth carried weight. Because behind every Panther wreck lay a story, a tank stranded by its own brilliance, a machine too perfect for the imperfect world of war. And as the Shermans rumbled forward, clanking through mud and rubble, they carried with them the ugly, stubborn truth of modern warfare. Victory belonged not to the most beautiful weapon, but to the one that worked when it mattered. July 20, 1944. Near Le Desert, Normandy. The road to St. Lo was nothing but churned mud and broken metal. The Germans had fought for every inch, and the fields were littered with their machines, Tigers, Stooges, and Panthers, smoldering like monuments to misplaced faith. Staff Sergeant Bobby Haynes sat atop his Sherman, helmet tilted back, the smell of gasoline in the humid air. Mechanics worked nearby, patching treads, hammering armor plates back into shape. One crew even replaced a transmission using nothing but salvaged parts from 3 other tanks. The sight reminded Haynes of something Captain Price once said: "The Sherman isn't built to survive a war. It's built so the next one can replace it before sundown." He had laughed then, but now, watching his tank come back to life after yet another fight, he realized how true it was. "Sherman's like a farm truck," Miller said, tightening a bolt. Treat her right, she'll get you home. Treat her rough, she'll still get you close enough to fight. The tank's engine coughed once, then roared to life. The men cheered. Another one back in the fight. Across the field, an abandoned Panther sat in a ditch, one tread missing, its engine deck pried open, blackened from fire. A perfect design undone by real conditions. Price arrived in a jeep, mud splattering his uniform. They left that Panther 3 miles from where they started. Ran out of oil, he said. Crew just walked away. Haynes glanced at the Sherman behind him. Ours would have found a way. Exactly. Price pointed toward the convoy forming up. That's why you boys keep rolling. You're fighting with tanks that forgive you. There's punish them. Later that afternoon, the Shermans moved out again, their steel tracks clattering over the cobblestone lanes of a ruined French village. Children peeked from shattered doorways, waving tiny flags. Feels strange, Jenkins said over the intercom, driving a tank they call a death trap while everyone cheers you on. Haynes smiled faintly. Maybe they don't see the tank. Maybe they see what it stands for, something that doesn't quit. The column halted at a crossroads where an enemy shell crater split the road. One Sherman slipped a track trying to cross. Within minutes, 2 crews jumped out to help, jacking it up, resetting the links. No orders, no hesitation, just muscle memory born from months of fieldwork. By dusk, the line rolled again. That was the Sherman's secret, it wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being enough to fight, enough to move, enough to keep an army rolling across Europe. That night, at the edge of a hedgerow camp, Haynes and his crew sat by a small fire. The sound of distant artillery echoed faintly, a reminder that the front was never far away. Lewis leaned back against a log, staring at the stars. You ever think, Sarge, why we keep calling her a death trap? We've seen plenty of tanks burn, German ones, too. Haynes took a sip from his canteen, eyes fixed on the horizon. Because she's honest. She doesn't pretend to be perfect. But she keeps us alive long enough to see the next dawn. Miller chuckled. Ain't that the truth? The wind carried the faint hum of engines, more Shermans rolling up the road, more steel, more men, more resolve. Each one was a cog in something larger, an unbreakable rhythm that didn't rely on genius engineering or flawless design. Just reliability. Just endurance. Just human grit in a machine's skin. The Germans built the Panther to win duels. The Americans built the Sherman to win campaigns. And by the summer of 1944, it was clear which philosophy was crushing the other beneath its treads. Then came the inevitable, the bark of German guns in the distance. Panther. 1 o'clock, behind the hedgerow. The column halted. The lead Sherman erupted in fire, its turret lifting slightly from the explosion. Over the intercom, screams crackled and cut to static. Driver, left. Take the flank. Haynes shouted. The Sherman jolted forward, cutting through the smoke. They fired on the move, one round, then another. The first shell ricocheted harmlessly off the Panther's front plate. The second, a lucky strike, hit its side just above the tread. The German tank stalled, smoke pouring from its rear deck. The Panther's gun tried to traverse, but the mechanism jammed. Then, a burst of tracer fire from nearby infantry tore through its vision slit. Got him! Jenkins yelled. That cat's done. But celebration was short-lived. Another Panther emerged from the far hedgerow, its long barrel gleaming in the sunlight. Back! Back! The Sherman reversed, mud flying, just as a German shell tore into the ground where it had been seconds before. The shockwave slammed Haynes against the hatch. His ears rang. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything but the roar of his own heartbeat. Gun still hot? Hot and ready. Lewis replied. Then send one back. The cannon boomed. The round struck the Panther's turret ring, a perfect shot. The enemy tank froze, then went up in flames. Inside the Sherman, the men exhaled, hands shaking, adrenaline surging. "You good, Sarge?" Jenkins asked, voice trembling. Haynes nodded slowly. "Yeah. Still here." They sat in silence for a long moment, the battle's echoes fading. Through the smoke, they saw the wrecked Panthers, monstrous machines silenced by smaller, humbler ones. That night, as they rested near a captured farmhouse, a war correspondent arrived, notebook in hand, camera slung over his shoulder. He asked the crew what it was like fighting in a Sherman. Lewis laughed bitterly. "You ever light a match inside a gas can?" Jenkins smirked. "It's like that, but with better armor." The reporter chuckled nervously. "Then why do you keep fighting in them?" Haynes looked up from his tin of rations. His face was smeared with soot and exhaustion. "Because she starts every morning," he said simply. "Because when we hit a ditch, she climbs out. When we take a shell, she gives us a way out. You can curse her all day long, but she never quits on you." The reporter wrote it down, nodding slowly. "So you trust her?" Haynes glanced at the Sherman parked under the fading moonlight, its engine still ticking from the day's heat. "I don't trust the tank," he said softly. "I trust the men inside it. But the Sherman, she lets us be men worth trusting." Silence fell again. The sound of frogs echoed from a nearby pond. Somewhere down the road, another column of tanks rolled by, their engines like a heartbeat that never stopped. In the morning, they'd push south, toward Coudence's, toward freedom, toward more fire and steel. And though history would call their tank a death trap, every man inside knew the truth. It wasn't the machine that won wars. It was the will to keep fighting, even inside one. August 3, 1944. Near Avranches, France. The breakout had succeeded. The German lines were collapsing, retreating east toward the Seine. Roads once filled with wrecked Allied tanks were now littered with the twisted hulks of Panthers and Tigers, burned out, abandoned, their crews long gone. For Staff Sergeant Bobby Haynes and his crew, it was the first time in months they could breathe without flinching at every distant explosion. Their Sherman sat parked beside a hedgerow, its armor scarred, its gun barrel blackened from a dozen fights. Haynes climbed onto the turret, scanning the landscape through a pair of battered field glasses. The fields were quiet now, save for the crows circling over the dead. "Never thought I'd see this," Lewis said softly, joining him. "Us pushing them back." Haynes lowered the glasses. "Funny thing," he said. "We used to call that Panther invincible. Now it's just another wreck on the roadside." Later that day, an ordnance team rolled in with trucks to tow captured German vehicles for study. Among them was a Panther, mostly intact except for a blown tread and a cracked mantlet. An American officer in clean fatigues examined it carefully, clipboard in hand. "Beautiful engineering," he said to no one in particular. "Sloped armor, perfect angles, long-barreled precision. If the Germans had more time, more fuel, more spare parts." Haynes overheard and laughed under his breath. "Yeah, and if frogs had wings, they wouldn't bump their tails on the ground." The officer looked over, half smiling. "You don't seem impressed, Sergeant." Haynes shrugged. "Sir, I've seen 3 of those things burn this week. Maybe they're works of art, but we ain't in a museum. We're in a war." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "And your Sherman?" "She's ugly," Haynes said. "Rattles like hell. Armor's thin, guns just good enough. But she runs. She always runs. That's all a man can ask for." That evening, the crew sat on ammo crates beside their tank, sharing a tin of beans and what passed for coffee. The conversation turned reflective, the kind that only happens when men have lived too close to death, too long. Jenkins stirred the fire with a stick. You ever think, Sarge, maybe they call it a death trap just to scare us less? Like if we say it first, it don't matter who else does. Haynes smiled faintly. Maybe. But I think it's more like, we made peace with it. We know what we're sitting in. No lies, no illusions. Lewis nodded. And yet we keep climbing in. Because we've got something they don't, Haynes replied, his voice steady. Not armor. Not firepower. Trust. We trust that even if one of us goes down, the rest keep moving. We fight together. That's what this tank's built for. The firelight flickered against the side of the Sherman, casting long shadows over its dents and scorch marks, each one a story, a survival. Nearby, a recovery team tried once again to tow a Panther. Its broken tread refused to cooperate, the cables snapping under strain. The German machine stood defiant, heavy and still, refusing to be moved even in defeat. Miller watched the struggle and muttered, "Guess even dead, it don't want to go anywhere." The men laughed quietly, exhaustion blurring into humor. By the time the moon rose, the camp had gone quiet. Only the soft ticking of cooling engines filled the night. Haynes lay back on his bedroll beside the Sherman, staring at the stars. He thought about everything, the Panthers, the Shermans, the men who fought inside both. Maybe the Germans built tanks to show their brilliance. Maybe the Americans built theirs to show their resolve. But as he drifted toward sleep, one thought lingered. A tank was only as strong as the men who trusted it. And for all its flaws, the Sherman was a tank men could believe in. August 15, 1944. Near Argenton, France, the Falaise Pocket. The final act of the Normandy campaign was unfolding in fire and chaos. The German army was trapped, its once proud panzer divisions cut off, encircled, and pounded from the air. The fields were littered with wreckage, burned-out vehicles, shattered guns, and the twisted remains of the mighty Panther tanks that once ruled the battlefield. Staff Sergeant Bobby Haynes' Sherman rolled forward carefully through the smoke, its tracks crushing shell casings and broken helmets beneath them. The stench of burned oil and death clung to the air like tar. "Jesus," whispered Lewis from the gunner's seat. "Looks like the end of the world." "Smells like it, too," Jenkins muttered. Haynes scanned the horizon through his periscope. Every few yards, they passed another disabled Panther, engines blown, tracks snapped, shells buried in their flanks. Some sat in shallow craters, others lay half-sunk in ditches, their hatches open like gaping mouths. Each was a monument to the same idea, that perfect machines could win imperfect wars. But perfection had failed. As the Sherman crew moved deeper into the valley, they came upon a column of captured German soldiers under guard, weary, mud-streaked, eyes hollow. Among them was a tank officer, his gray uniform smeared with grease. He glanced at Haynes' tank with something between bitterness and admiration. "Your Sherman," he said in broken English, "cheap, crude, but everywhere." Haynes nodded from the hatch. "That's the point." The German's lips twitched, half a smile, half a wound. "You win with quantity. We tried to win with quality. And now," he gestured to the burning wrecks around them. "Now both of us are buried under the result." Haynes didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That night, the 3rd Armored bivouacked near an abandoned French farmhouse. The fields glowed faintly under the moonlight, the fires still burning miles away. Haynes sat on the Sherman's turret, writing a letter home, his handwriting rough from exhaustion. "Dear Ma. You'd laugh to see what we call tanks out here. They break, they burn, they groan like old tractors. But they always start again. Every time I climb in, I think, maybe this one won't, and then she does. I guess that's what keeps us going too. We just start again. Love, Bobby." He folded the paper, tucking it into his jacket. At dawn, the convoy prepared to move east. Captain Price rode up in his jeep, pausing beside Haynes' tank. "You boys have done hell's work," Price said. "From Omaha to here, you've proven one thing: the Sherman's not just a tank. It's a promise. That no matter what breaks, we fix it. No matter who falls, we replace him. That's why we win." Haynes nodded, eyes on the horizon where the morning fog met the rising sun. "Guess the Panther never learned that lesson."